All right. We are preaching through the lectionary Psalms this summer, and when we prayed Psalm 16 earlier, I don't know about some of you, but, I can't immediately relate to it. There's this line here, verse 2, I say to the Lord, you are my Lord, apart from you, I have no good thing. Okay, I would love to be that person. All right, you probably would love to be that person. And on my best days, it's true in a real level. There's real faith and real trust that I have in the Lord. But a lot of this prayer, for me, when I pray it, is aspirational. I want, this is sort of who I am, but it's also sort of not who I am. And but it's also who I want to be. So the question is, what do we do with a psalm like this? Some psalms, it's like, Lord, I'm surrounded by enemies, wipe them all out. I'm like, yeah, I get that one. But some songs like this are these amazing pictures of somebody who has this deep and profound trust in God. How in the world do we do it? How do we approach a prayer like this? So years ago, when I lived in New Jersey, my neighborhood that I lived in was 95% Spanish-speaking. And so I wanted to dust off my high school Spanish and learn how to speak Spanish. And I checked out these cassettes from the library. This was pre-Duolingo. This was back in the dark ages. How to learn Spanish. I had a good friend, a Venezuelan woman who was in our church small group. And I was like, Nora, help me out here. How do I learn Spanish? And what do you think she told me? Anyone? Any ideas? Go to the country. Yeah, sort of. She said, watch Spanish language television. She's like, that's how you do it. Keep listening to those cassettes, buddy. But really, if you want to learn how to speak a language, you have to immerse yourself in other people who already know how to speak that language. That's the best way to do it. So picture me in my basement apartment in New Jersey watching Mexican soap operas, trying to learn Spanish. I don't know how much good it did me. And that's the way we learn a language when we're younger. We learn it by listening to other people who already know how to speak the language. That's the best way to learn a language. Learning how to pray is no different. We say most weeks the Psalms are the prayer book of ancient Israel. They're the prayer book of Jesus, prayer book of the people of God for millennia. We come to these Psalms, and they're other people's prayers. They're other. They're like, I wouldn't have written that kind of prayer. Exactly. And the subtitle of this psalm is a Psalm of David. So you look at this, and you are my Lord, apart from you I have no good thing, and you read about David's life in the Old Testament. Amazing moments where he was on the run. Powerful King Saul was trying to kill him, and he's going from place to place to place to place, just trusting in the Lord. You're saying, okay, maybe David was feeling it this day when he prayed this prayer. And I can grant that maybe David has this experience, or maybe you have this experience, even if I don't. So this is somebody else's prayer, so I'm going to pray it. And that is okay. That is as it should be. But if you've read the Old Testament and you know the full story about David, he may have had days like this. He did not end like this. He kind of crashed and burned. He took his life into his own hands. Instead of trusting the Lord, he's like, hey, I can maneuver my way to safety. So ultimately, this prayer doesn't find its home. It may not find its home in your heart. Ultimately, it doesn't even find its home in David's heart. So that should leave us longing, like who in the world, this is a great prayer to pray, but who in the world can pray this prayer and not perjure themselves? And the Sunday school answer is true here. Jesus. Every single time that Jesus prayed this prayer for the entirety of his life, he wasn't embellishing. He was being absolutely truthful. He wasn't like, I wish I could become this kind of person. This was his prayer journal. He's like, this is where I'm at right here and right now. So Jesus grew up as a faithful Jew, and as a faithful Jew, these would have been the prayers he learned how to pray by praying. And ultimately, he makes this prayer his own, and it finds its ultimate and best home coming from his heart and his life and his lips. So Psalm 16 is most truthfully prayed, not by me, not by you, even on your best days, not even by David, but ultimately by Jesus. And if you use your imagination and you read through the Gospels, you could imagine Jesus praying this prayer. He was teaching with power and authority. He was teaching truthfully the ways of God, the law of God. He was healing the sick. He was casting out evil spirits. One of the things that kind of blows me away about Jesus' life is he's interrupted all the time. And I don't know about you, but I hate interruptions. And Jesus is like, okay, sure. I thought I was going to go this way. Now we're going to go this way. This is God in human flesh we're talking about. So he pivots. People come up to him. And whenever somebody interrupted him, they always had a really hard question or a really pressing need. And Jesus is like, okay. And then Jesus gets all these enemies, people who wanted to kill him. Not just people that said bad things about him, but people that actually wanted to take his life. And you could imagine him sneaking away at many of those junctures in the gospel to pray this prayer and say, Father, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. You can imagine him putting his hands in again and again and again into the loving hands of his Father. This psalm is this beautiful and deep connection between God the Father and God the Son. This beautiful prayer of trust. Jesus continuing to center his heart deeply on the Father. Now, why am I emphasizing this point? That Psalm 16 is most truthful, most authentic, most heartfelt, most faithful to what is actually going on when it is being prayed by Jesus. Because I want us to consider something in this prayer that you may have missed or you may have skipped over. So imagine Jesus, again, during the time of his life, the time of the Gospels, our true, our faithful King, praying this part of the psalm. Verse 3. I say of the holy people who are in the land, they are the noble ones, in whom is all my delight. What in the world is that about? He calls them noble ones. The word can also mean majestic. Sometimes in the Old Testament it's used to describe mountains. You know, you think you look at a mountain, you're like, is the mountain out today? And you look at it, you're like, you're just sort of centered because you're in awe of what you see. It's also used to describe these ancient cedar trees that were ginormous, beautiful, strong, rooted. Jesus is describing a people of great honor, standing, and integrity. These are people. He's not talking about mountains or trees. He's talking about people that inspire awe in him. Who are these people that Jesus has in mind? Now, if you read the rest of the psalm, the immediate context of verse 3, it's clear he's not talking about the hypocrites. He's not talking about the people who raise the flag of God. We are here for God. We are here for Jesus, but their hearts were far from him, far from the Father. He's not talking about them. All right? The rest of the psalm makes that clear. But he is speaking about, in the context of his life, his disciples. Clearly flawed and imperfect ones that we read about in the gospel, they're a lot like us. They had a real faith. They actually left their lives to follow Jesus. There was really something going on there, but they were deeply and profoundly flawed. They missed him. They sort of understood him, but sort of didn't understand him. They were a people a lot like me and a lot like you, who on their very best days would pray Psalm 16, and it would be partially true about them. They were trusting in the Lord, but also it was probably mostly aspirational. This is the kind of person that I would like to be. Now remember, this prayer is most truthful when Jesus is praying it, and he is praying this and has prayed this over his people. Jesus is saying to the Father from within the intimacy of his prayer life. Psalm 16, if you want to use a modern example, is sort of Jesus' prayer journal. And, sometimes we pray things that we don't say to anybody else. Because prayer is this place of great intimacy, and that's totally okay. Jesus talks about praying in your closet, that part of your life that no one else has access to except the Father. And Jesus is saying, Father, the people you have given me, his first disciples, Peter, James, and John, etc., 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 you, me, this congregation, okay, not some imaginary super congregation, but this congregation. Father, they are the noble ones. I look at them, and it's like seeing Mount Rainier. It takes my breath away. They are the one in whom, what does he say, is all my delight. Do you imagine Jesus prays that about you? Says that about you to the Father in his most intimate place, not when he's just sort of trying to say the politically correct thing or the appropriate thing, but in his most intimate moment, he looks at you and he says, noble one, in whom is all my delight. Has anybody ever had one of these? Anybody? Rogers chocolates, maple caramel? They make them in Victoria. Change your life. Okay? Changed my life. A couple weeks ago, Jamie and Jahan, they were going to Victoria, and they make them up there, and I said, get me some of these. All right? No matter what. Do you want anything from Canada? Yes, these. I love these things. And when I eat them, and they didn't have them. They were sold out because people are smart and love these things. When I eat these things, what I do, this is probably an overshare, is I cut them, each one, you can cut it into quarters, and it's perfect. And that way I could pop the whole big thing in my mouth, but that's too much. I want to savor it. I want to enjoy it. So what I do is I cut it into quarters so I can just eat them one at a time and extend this beautiful experience. I would say that I delight in these things. I want to prolong the contact time between me and these things. I don't want it to be fleeting. And that's what Jesus thinks about his people. He actually enjoys being with you and enjoys being with me and enjoys being with us here today in worship. Now, I know what you're thinking. Come on. Seriously? Because to be delighted in, we're kind of screwed, right? Because that's what we want. That's what we long for. We want to be not just acceptable and pass some sort of minimal standard, but we want to be a delight in the eyes of those that are meaningful to us. But the actual experience of being delighted in, it's kind of like, I don't know about that. It makes me squirm a little. Okay, it makes me squirm a lot. When I am loved in this way, there is this pressing back of my spirit, a hitch. Am I being deceived? Am I just hearing what I want to hear from them? Am I just picking out a Bible verse here that is going to be soothing and comforting to me? Is it wishful thinking, Or am I being manipulated? Am I being played? Think about when you get a compliment. Okay, somebody compliments you on something you've done. What do? We try to, tennis ball hit that thing right back into their court. Say, it was nothing. When maybe it was something. Maybe it really wasn't nothing. Maybe it was really something that was kind of amazing. So our mind and our heart create this narrative. It was really nothing. We get this person delighting in us. Again, we're built to be delighted in, and somebody actually delights in us, and we're like, no, that wasn't that big of a deal. And we call it Christian humility or whatever. Or we cynically laugh it away. Oh, yeah, whatever. You should see my whatever. Like great theologian Tom Petty said, even the losers get lucky sometimes, We're like, all right. Or suspicion. Oh, you're trying to play me. You just want to get into my sweet side because there's something else you want from me. You actually didn't take delight in me. So their delight in you becomes the stories that we tell ourselves. It's like, oh, this is actually a setup. This is meant to make me look like a fool. So we want to be delighted in. But it's so hard when it actually happens. C.S. Lewis tells a story of how he was reading in a magazine article by some well-meaning Christian who, pontificated that the most important thing is what we think of God. And I can imagine that person who wrote that article, using that inflection. And C.S. Lewis is like, that sounds really super spiritual. I mean, who can be against a statement like that? The most important thing is what we think about God. And C.S. Lewis says, by God himself, it is not. He said, the most important thing is what God thinks of us. But, he said, therein lies the problem. He said to be, and he used the phrase, this beautiful C.S. Lewis phrase, to be an ingredient in the divine happiness. All right, when you teach at Oxford, that's the phrasing that you use, I suppose. But to be an aspect of God's deep delight and joy, he said that is an unbearable weight. He called it the weight of glory. And he wasn't talking about the glory of God. He was talking about the glory in us as we are loved by God. And he says this is what we were created for, what we long for, what we were built for. When we don't have it, it's like this absence that sort of drives our life from one thing to one thing to one thing, or one person to one person to one person. But he says when we finally have it, he said it's like an unbearable weight, something that we cannot bear. An unbearable, an unliftable heaviness of being delighted in by God. So I agree with Lewis. I think it is the most important question that you can ask and I can ask and this church can ask. What does God think of me? And I also believe it's the most important work that you and I can do as Christians. To be able to hear and believe and experience, not just in your mind, but in your body, in your heart, in your soul, Jesus' profound delight in you. In the noble ones is all my delight. So when Jesus says these words to you today, I delight in you, these are words that you were created to hear. And until we hear them, we will not be healed and made whole. And we can try to theologize these words away. We can cynically laugh them off. Well, Jesus probably doesn't know the full me yet. Perhaps it was a time in my life where I could believe that it applied to you, but did not apply to me. But the challenge of this psalm is this: to hear these words of Jesus' delight in you and to learn how to receive them. We want to learn how to drink them in. And this is, I believe, the most critical thing in the life of discipleship. And they are the foundation upon which all else is built. Dear friends, Jesus delights in you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.